Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Jonathan Foyle, who studied art history at the Courtauld and did a PhD in archaeology at the University of Reading, and has had a distinguished career as curator of historic buildings for the Historic Royal Palaces and CEO of World Monuments Fund Britain, and is currently part-time church buildings advisor for the Diocese of Bath and Wells, and is also a keen student of form and iconography of late medieval and Tudor furniture. Has been so for the past 10 years. And today he will speak to us about material evidence, recently discovered royal joinery from the Tudor era. So I hand over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Rembrandt. Thank you, everybody, for logging in as well. Okay, let's get this up in the. Okay, is that coming up clear?
Yes, it is.
Right, then we shall go. There's a lot to cover in the next 45 minutes. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and thank you for watching. So this topic is the unlikely, improbable tale of rediscovering royal joinery from the Tudor era. It seems improbable because Simon Thurley, in his 1993 book on Tudor palaces, described this bedhead as the only surviving piece of furniture that can certainly be ascribed to Henry VIII's court. Now, we're very used to the idea that the Civil War scoured the palaces, demolished them, and destroyed royal chattels, melting down the gold and silver. What happened to furniture? How did this example survive? And I would ask you that if it were not for the royal motto and the cipher and the description in the middle with the date of the wedding that it was made for, how would we recognize this as a royal object? If this survived and exists, how many other pieces might be out there unattributed? And I ask that question because we have a technology today that allows us to scour the world, looking through collections of museums, sometimes private collections, auctioneers' catalogues for things that are of interest to us. And in the field of medieval and Tudor furniture, there's a very limited back catalogue, as Penelope Eames' book from 1977 on medieval domestic furniture. There's Victor Chinnery's book on the English oak tradition, but that starts in 1500 and quickly goes on to vernacular examples. So what would royal work be like if we came across it? It's an open question. What do you make, for example, of these various fragments of pieces of timber, and how can we understand them materially and head toward an attribution? Now, there's a very reasonable response to that question. If you go out looking for royal things, then you're over-optimistic and hoping to find things. Now, 10 years ago, I'd completely agree with you, but my experience is that there are things lost in plain sight. The instant reaction, though, is on a spectrum of between being foolish and gullible in believing anything that comes your way described as royal, or anything with a coat of arms on. And in many cases, that would be true. But the other end of the spectrum, if I just move this, we get to the overly negative end, that the area where the wise would reside, those who are non-committal and cautious and don't want to say yes to anything. There is an extreme at that far end, in that you have to be receptive in order to assess evidence, because otherwise we might spend our entire lives without making any discoveries at all. There's always interest on the way. You can always learn things. And therefore, the middle ground of being thorough and rational is a reasonable place to be. But we are creatures who tend to indulge in confirmation bias, politically and sometimes historically. And Francis Bacon in 1602 describes the human condition that this represents. The human understanding, when it's once adopted an opinion, draws all things to support and agree with it. And though there be a greater number and weight of instances to be found on the other side, yet these it either neglects and despises, or sets aside and rejects in order its former conclusions may remain inviolate. We see what we want to see. Now, Again, that is a reasonable position, but I'd like to think that if you occupy the middle ground of being thorough and rational with what you're looking at, you can both be receptive to new evidence, but be cautious enough to treat it circumspectly when interesting things that are worth exploring come your way. And therefore, C.B. McCulloch, I think, is absolutely correct. Historians should publish only those new descriptions, explanations, interpretations, which they have tested and found to be rationally justified. Now, this is a case study I open with in expert opinion. It's the Church of St. Leonard's in Old Warden in Bedfordshire, where I was invited by Sarah Morris, who was writing a book on the material culture of Henry VIII. And she described to me a church which was refurbished in the 1840s by Lord Ongley, who collected, as many antiquarians did, chattels, bric-a-brac, the depredations of the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, sold generally through London auction houses, the age of Walter Scott. And my focus here were some panels which were attributed by local historians to belonging to a chapel of Anne of Cleves in Bruges. What's Anne of Cleves got to do with Bruges? Pevsner wisely asked. And here we arrive at the altar. It's not the sole location for these panels, but it contains the majority of them. And this is a 20th century structure. We go through the gates to look at panels of which there are 3 types. They're nicely made, aren't they? A, C, and a lion's mask, and an escarbuncle, an heraldic device. Now, of course, if you're looking at an original and genuine object, heraldry does the heavy lifting. It takes you straight to the provenance, the patronage, and you can create a context from that. But who would these have belonged to? Well, I can see why AC starts to be a bit persuasive with a coronet over the top. But I climb inside the altar to have a look at this material in the round, and there you see pretty fresh looking timber. I mean, it doesn't look like it's 500 years old. There are a couple of nail holes there, but they're not regular. They wouldn't seem to be a fixing within a grid or framework. One of them has some evidence of mold on the back as if it were against a wall, but that doesn't take long to accumulate. So what can you assess from that? Not a great deal. I invited Helen Hughes, the paint analyst. She's a specialist in early paint finishes and headed English Heritage's conservation workshop for 20 years. And she's looking for any traces of characteristic surface paint by which to give us a date on these panels. And all she could find was a chalky residue. So she said, this is unusual, but there's no distinctive paint finish there. And so we go to an expert opinion. And I don't mean to pick on Charles Tracy. It just happens that he's a great scholar, done a lot of work on medieval church furnishings, and produced this, the best book on churches furnished with this kind of material. And he visited this church in Old Warden and said that they are fine quality, but 18th century French work. And one can sympathize with that opinion, because there on the right is a detail of a chair of 1770, it is French, in the Wallace collection in London. And you can see an oval cartouche, which is broken at the top with some leaf molding projecting from it. It's broken at the sides and at the bottom as well, where you have a termination, a dual termination at the bottom. So 18th century French, maybe it looks fresh enough to be of that period. However, always topical me, if you go behind King Charles III, you would find the material remnant of Anne of Cleves, which really demands attention. That is her tomb monument. And there you find precisely the same pattern, not just a version of it, but if you compare these pink stone panels from her tomb with this carved work, this looks to have been made from the same pattern. However, the 19th century was very clever at emulation. So perhaps the lack of paint, the freshness at the back, and the similarity with what is a publicly accessible monument right by the coronation floor of Westminster Abbey means that there was an early 19th century copyist who somehow made a version of these. And then in the 20th century, they wound up in this altar. Christine Hill, a local historian, had already been to Anne of Cleves' tomb, and so she was all credit to her for doing that. Furniture and these chattels are guilty until proven innocent. It's an inversion of human justice. You judge things with caution, and hence the blue and purple end of the spectrum is quite heavily populated. And so what could I conclude from all of that? I concluded with a report to Sarah Morris that these are probably 19th century copies of the panels from Anne of Cleves' tomb in Westminster Abbey. That all changed within a couple of months because Bonham's auction house offered a rare James I carved oak panel. You can see we've now gone from my 19th century back to the 18th century, and then now we're in the 17th century, which matches a 16th century monument. So much for expert opinion. Circa 1610, originally possibly at Suffolk House on the Strand. How the initials AC relate to Suffolk House, it explains, is unclear. But if you compare this panel with one at the Museum of London on the left, which is where the Suffolk House attribution came from, you can see it's very possible that it was from Suffolk House, but in its second iteration. These are salvaged panels. You can see from the dark patch on the inside that these were waxed when they were once set within a timber frame. But once liberated from that and reused, they were covered with this, a gesso finish of glue and plaster. And this, the remnants of it at least, are what Helen Hughes had discovered in her exploration. Furthermore, this area, which neatly surrounds the carved field, is the level of trimming for the panels in Old Warden Church. So maybe they were cut out of the frame, a good number of them, to be reused as salvage. Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? Because it looks like then this may, in fact, be part of a suite of furnishings approved by Anne of Cleves for her domestic interiors with these timber panels. And then the stonework with these cut moldings emulates the timber. Given that a tomb will de facto be the last commission one will make, then it makes sense that a pre-existing commission within your workshop might be duplicated for your tomb with the implicit understanding that it has been approved. The Bonham's panel allowed us to do some dendrochronology. It was a very clear result by Dr. Peter Klein, a specialist in Netherlandish panel paintings, and he found this was German, Western German to Netherlands at the origin of Anne of Cleves, and the rings grew from 1383 to 1525, and with the trimmed oak missing, added back on, plausible date 1544, just 4 years after her divorce from Henry VIII. So I was playing cautious on this, but in fact what we have is material culture of the interiors of Anne of Cleves in the years immediately following her divorce from Henry VIII. It shows us how continental styles were introduced and no doubt spread through fashionable London houses. So that felt like a contribution and a surprising result from a claim of local history. So I give things the benefit of the doubt now, and I'm keen to explore evidence. I find it interesting. Let's move now to a case study of a forger and his model. This man is George Shaw from Upper Mill in West Yorkshire, near the Lancashire border, in Manchester orbit. And he was born in 1810 and was a known forger. He lived in a family house called St. Chad's in Upper Mill, which he turned into a pseudo-monastic complex after Pugin's The Grange in Ramsgate, no doubt. And he filled it with Tudor style work, this overmantel, for example, and these various furnishings, all in the late 15th, early 16th century style. He's acknowledged to be a forger by people who lived while he did. This is a book by Ammon Wrigley, who was born, he was 15 years old when Shaw died in 1876. And his recollections are that Shaw was a collector of antiques, and that the hall at St. Chad's in Upper Mill bears witness to his diligence and his success in this interesting field of research. He had an easy conscience, he said, so that when genuine antiques were not procurable, he set to work and manufactured his own. He, of course, followed the antique model. Well, anyone's alarm bells will be ringing at this point, and I think we can extend the spectrum to the blue and purple end with an ultraviolet don't even think about it sector. However, look, I'm game, and I want to know what his models might have been. The story really starts at Shaw's friend, a man called James Dearden, whose family inherited or purchased the manor of Rochdale from the Byrons. And in 1829, in Shaw's diaries, is recorded the visit of a mutual friend, in which the Deardens showed him a very capital collection of antiquities and curiosities of every kind. And amongst other things, the state bed from Latham House, which was there during the siege. We're talking about the 1640s Civil War siege. In 1913, this bed remained in Dearden's house and photographed in the catalogue of sale. And it was rediscovered subsequently in the 1970s. And it's now known as the Thomas Stanley bed, at the time marketed as the greatest Gothic bed known to England. Thomas Stanley from Latham was the stepfather of Henry VII and the husband of Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry. It's a rather magnificent thing, isn't it? Whether the restoration is entirely correct is another issue. Shaw then used models to make copies, his forgeries indeed, and wrote to the descendant of Thomas Stanley, the 14th Earl of Derby, and with a letter that said, "I've been given to understand you're anxious to get to Knowsley, the other Derby house, all the supposed relics of the pillaged and dismantled house of Latham." This is 1842. He's only 32 years old. His family, involved with the mill business, had fallen on hard times. And you can see from Shaw pieces on the left there is a buffet made for the Earl of Derby in 1849. It's actually based on an early 16th century four-poster bed turned into a bookcase at Chetham's Library. He thought it was a genuine Tudor antiquity. But his model here, you can see, is partly based on the Thomas Stanley bed. You've got these cells here, these quatrefoils, and then this organic work, and it's syncopated, and you see the same thing derived from the headboard of the Thomas Stanley bed. But there are other influences. This is quite a loose diaper work. This is a neater version, and both this diaper work and the shape of the shields hanging within this foliage is derived from a second piece of furniture. And it's this, and I'm very grateful to Ian Coulson for introducing me to this in 2013. He'd bought it several years previously and thought it was a bed of antiquity, and I helped to identify it as what I'm going to explain to you now. And in fact, I've been interested and involved with this for 10 years or so. The imagery on this bed involves the lions holding roses within shields, and you see them on the top there. And then there are royal arms divided into fleur-de-lis and English lions at the bottom, and again on that footboard. This is a cross of St. George, of which there are two side crests. This is one of the side crests. The reason the front crest isn't there is because you will find it over the door in George Shaw's house. This is truncated and reduced, which tells us a couple of things. It was salvage when he got hold of it, and it was also thought of as not particularly important. It was of decorative interest only. It was never celebrated or paraded as a relic of a royal bed, but we have purely royal iconography. The roses being held up by the lions there were only used as symbols by one king and queen, that is Henry VII, and the late Gothic style of this bed purports to be of that period. The question is it genuine or not? And then we'll talk about where Shaw might have seen it. Well, it's very high quality, isn't it? It's a beautiful piece of carving. It has an intensity to it, a seriousness. It is, in fact, a work of art. And you have this couple with a hand on their breast. But what's the serpent doing there? Why has it got an apple, and why are they holding one? Let's just have a look at Shaw's version of that scene, which is stripped of the black gunk that he put on his work to persuade people that it was old. This one was made for the Duke of Northumberland, 1847-8. He made the Duke of Northumberland about £600 worth of curiously discovered antiquities to fill his remodeling projects. But look at this, it's like a cartoon version. How can they both be by the same person? let's look at the materiality of the what I think was Shaw's model, and we can see, well, old wood. And reasonably, people might say, well, you can make things out of old wood. Of course, a good forger has a good stock of old wood at hand. This has been assessed with dendrochronology, and all of the wood came from the same source. Each of the features fits neatly against the next. It is not an assembly of old parts, but it was made at one point in time. And you can see that there's evidence here for re-drilling of the mortises where they've worked loose over time. Also evidence of how worm has worked under the surface of a painted finish since lost. And Helen Hughes has assessed the painted finish of this and found typically medieval paint all over it and of a notably high quality. The side rails are also missing, and these holes there are for a pin system typical of medieval construction. This is the same area on a George Shaw bed, and the two could never be confused. This is one made for the Earl of Derby during the 1840s. So they don't look the same. Materially, they are quite different. And the imagery holds information about the intellectual archaeology of this thing. So on the right-hand side, you see the couple with the hand on their breast. And there you see an image of a royal marriage made in the same decade from the Beauchamp pageant. And you have Henry V and Catherine of France in the moment of marriage with the hand on the breast and the hands held in mutuality. In this case, they're shown as mirror opposites, so that the pledge is foremost in both cases, and the holding of the apple, which in medieval art was both a symbol of the downfall of Adam and Eve, but also in held by Christ and the Virgin, it's a symbol of redemption. And that would be the reason why they're ignoring the apple in the serpent's mouth, because their mutual gaze, the pledge of fidelity, overcomes temptation. It's a marriage piece, and therefore the acorn next to the man can be seen in contemporary art. In Romance literature, you see Tristram and Isolde being married by a tree, and next to Tristram's torso here, this is in Chester Cathedral, you see the acorn symbolic of male fertility. That worked its way into the royal bedchambers in the early Tudor era. Here's Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, she being the honeysuckle and he being the acorn, bound together in mutuality in the Burrell collection. Well, we might say that Shaw was a brilliant scholar and understood all this. And the problem with that argument is that he doesn't include them on his beds. He instead has a reductivist idea that this simply represents Adam and Eve. And so the Christ and the Virgin type and antitype is reduced to a simplistic reading. All of the various fruits within the tree are reduced simply to apples. It is a story of sin. If then this is a royal marriage bed and the materiality and the imagery suggests that it may be, well, then it meets with a firm context, because we know where the bed was prepared for the royal marriage in January 1486 of Henry and Elizabeth of York. And it was in the painted chamber in Westminster, set as all beds had been since the 13th century, all state beds, against the mural painted for Henry III in the 1260s. And you can see how this bed sits against that mural. Its 5'6" width is exactly half of the 11 foot established by scholars such as Paul Binsky and Christopher Wilson. And furthermore, the division of the headboard is in synergy with the rhythm of the mural over the top. Furthermore, that crest follows the line of the mural. It gives space either side of the bed then for a corridor, and those corridors also frame the quatrefoil through to the chapel of St. Lawrence next door, through which Compline could be heard at nighttime. It fits the context very nicely indeed. Shaw's beds, however, and I've hand measured this one, are smaller because they're made to be functional and to fit inside Victorian houses. And so the 5'6" or 66 inches is reduced to just 57 inches. It's 8 inches shorter in this dimension, which registers not at all within the painted chamber. And Shaw never offered any beds with the claim that they were marital royal beds, as this one's imagery purports that it was. But this is not the only material that Shaw had access to, if it is correct. In 2014, Joanna Booth offered 4 what she called corner posts, which she estimated at being around 1520. They're clearly of some antiquity, and they were used for salvage in a stud wall to go by the remains of nails in them. One has a carved fleur-de-lis, she said, one with the letter H. Now, these have been attributed in a peer-reviewed journal as being identical to those on Shaw's beds, by an author or scholar who believes that the last one is a work by George Shaw. And he said they're presumably the remains of a 4th bed. We don't need to presume if we examine them. Here we can see the 4 posts and the similarity of the carving to the posts of the bed. But there's more information in them. There is an H here and half of an R. This one's been sawn in half, again, when these things were used for salvage. And then there is a fleur-de-lis, a royal device. Doesn't yet mean they're royal. But to look at the structure of them, if they were indeed bedposts, you would need them to show that there is a 90-degree junction with a mitre coming out in adjacent sides of a square. Instead, there are 3 sets of junctions within this post, so that we have 1, 2, 3 lots at the top there are coming in at 180 degrees on both sides. This is impossible for a bed. How would you get into it? Furthermore, they are flat at the back. They're not meant to be seen in the round, and there is a rebate that panels once upon a time slotted into. We can see holes here for dowels where a moulding strip was set over at this level, and the same thing up here on the capitals. There's a scarf joint where this particular post was extended to make it suitable as salvage for a stud wall or similar. And then there's evidence down here of an early apotropaic burn mark, which archaeologists in the last 10, 15 years or so have recognized part of the ritualistic burning of timber by carpenters, largely between the 13th and the 17th centuries. This post has XI or IX, which shows there are at least 9 of them. And I defy you to find a 9-poster bed. Be interesting, though. So if we put all that together, we find a type in the V&A, a comparable type, and that is wainscoting. This is a wall paneling within a particular framework of pilasters. This one dates to about 1520 to 25 by the estimate of the V&A, and here it is stretched out as far as it exists, with truncated posts here, and then a lovely corner piece, which is irregular, and some of these posts do have an irregular profile. So they were made to operate around the perimeter of a room, probably navigating features like a fireplace or door. And this drawing from northern France gives you the general effect of an interior with such material. The V&A piece also has a numbering system, but the carpenters to slot the correct pieces together. So this has a structural logic, and if we follow that logic and say that this is extremely similar to the carving, if not the form of the bedposts, well then it was surely accompanied by rails of a similar kind. This is the leaf and blossom type that you see on the bed. So I've just slotted those in to see what it would like when we start to reconstruct it. We can tell from an X-ray of the scarfed piece from the top of one of the posts stuck on the bottom of another to extend it, we can see an iron pin, and I'm very grateful to a vet that allowed me to put it through an animal's X-ray chamber to work that out. And these then are very similar to the pegs on the bottom of the finials of that Henry VII bed, let's call it. So we can put a finial on the top of some sort. We'll use what we know to go along with. And then we need to figure out what shape that adds up to. And there are numerous kinds of screen. The simplest type you would see at Middleton St Leonard in Lancashire. And there is one rail between each of the posts on this screen, with one, if only one, but highly decorative panel set between them. And so its simplest iteration would look like that, but that's a lot of finials going on there and probably a bit monotonous. If we assume that it was syncopated with large posts and then muntins set between them on a stretcher rail, which is very possibly the case. And then with the cover strips bottom and top, as we can see the evidence for, then it starts to look something like this. Perhaps the armorial pieces interspersed with other carved sections. Possibly a plainer linen fold at the bottom so that eye level is catered for. And then we can have things like these features between the main finials so that, again, you find a syncopation. And once you start to reconstruct on this sort of model, you find the same kind of structure on the footboard of this bed. And a great similarity, actually, to the Thomas Stanley bed. Now, I would say that these panels may be rather different, but still the general effect and structure could be so similar that if this were paneling that had been visible to Thomas Stanley in 1500, the design of his bed may have been made after it. And I say that with the observation that these are redundant. They look like these knops or bosses, which received mortices in this structure, but they have no function here. So they become decorative. You don't see them on the Henry VII bed. George Shaw certainly saw these, because you can see that this feature of a punched triangular spandrel is used on some of his furniture. These buffets, for example, have this instead of the type that you see on the Henry VII bed. So this seems to have been together as a group and witnessed by Shaw in his workshop, or at least near his workshop. He had these pieces accessible. They weren't done from drawings, they were done from direct observation by his carvers. Here's another set of royal arms, and we can see this, these royal arms are on a piece of furniture made by Shaw for Chetham's Library in Manchester in the 1840s. And you have these fleur-de-lis and lions, again separated as you see the arms represented on the bed. Here's the underside of them, showing redundant dowel fixings. They have nothing to do with this present piece of furniture. This is from a previous life. And you see similar dowel fixings on the much worm-eaten crests on that royal bed as well. So the same kind of technique. To compare these shields, which were salvage in Shaw's hands, with Shaw's versions of them, you see a very different kind of material surface, a much more mechanical approach in Shaw's workshop. We might say, well, how can these be Henry VII? Because we all know that the lion and the greyhound were Henry VII's arms. However, in the first year, this was not inevitable to him. He had to choose his supporting devices. And if we go to the Bishop's Palace in Exeter, a fireplace made by Bishop Peter Courtney, probably within the first year of the reign of Henry VII, shows a device at the top of two greyhounds, which is, again, not like the final resolved arms, but this seems to speak of the first year in which these decisions are being made. There are revisions to the way that Henry is asserting his heraldry. It was not given, it was chosen, and he may have changed his mind. When we look at the crown at the top, we can see this carving work of a ball between two cusps, and then a small squarish feature cut with two chip markings is exactly the way that this crown is made under the workshop of Edward IV and the choir stalls of St. George's Chapel in Windsor. It is a type that is followed here. But when Shaw makes his version of this ensemble, gone is the Gothic script, and here is the by now customary capital letters. The lion has become a cartoon, and the crown is not of this late medieval type. It is of the type that Charles II brings in this with a St. Edward's crown. Again, I'm on topic. So Shaw's version is in turn put within a pseudo-Elizabethan context, and it starts to lose sense. He's incredibly important in that he's observing this early work, but he betrays his ignorance when he creates versions of it. So what's this thing from? There is an argument that it was a pillow a board at the end of the bolster of a bed, but I don't agree with that. I think that would rip the fabrics that are draped over it and probably take the royal eye out, and would not provide a bracing function, which these things normally did. Instead, these kinds of carvings tend to be made to fit a format, and the straightness of the back of the leg here, up to this point certainly, and then the implied arch over the top, is the kind of thing you see where arms with supporters are cut to fit within some kind of geometric or shape. And you can see that happening throughout, with the wing, for example, following that line. So we move then on to documentation, because what does all this add up to? How can, if this is correct, how can George Shaw have had access to all this early material in one place? After a day's seminar at the V&A, a symposium really in 2019, two researchers really took over the research in terms of publishing, and Peter Linfield at Manchester Metropolitan and Stephanie Brooke, an independent researcher, both pursued the idea that the bed went from Westminster or Windsor ultimately as a gift from Elizabeth I to Sir Nicholas Mosley, Mayor of Manchester. And in the Kenyon College's peregrinations, Stephanie Brooke writes, the Queen showed her approval of Nicholas Mosley upon being knighted in 1600. She gave him not a plate or a miniature, but an elaborately carved bed and matching furniture, as she heard he had built himself a new house. And this is that new house, Hough End Hall, near Manchester. And then the bed, according to this story, went to Ancoats in Manchester and then to Rolleston Hall in Staffordshire. And both Brooke and Linfield follow this provenance. And to be fair, I was asked to contribute to the book, but I wasn't certain about this, so I wanted to research it in more detail. And the claim is that the bed, including its royal source, is recorded in Sir Nicholas's will, which was written in 1612. I give and bequeath to my said wife in lieu of her chamber 2 of my best beds, with the furniture accordingly, except the best tapestry coverings and the best bedstock, the Queen's gift also accepted. And the reference there is to Williamson, 1888. Mrs. Williamson wrote sketches of Fallowfield and the surrounding manors of Manchester. And here is the quote from the will of Sir Nicholas Mosley. Now, the thing is that we don't have a picture of what's described there. The best bedstock, well, that could look like anything, couldn't it? So we have the vague idea that Elizabeth I gave a bed to Nicholas Mosley, but we don't know the description of that particular bed. It is a striking thing, though, isn't it, for a queen to have given someone in Manchester in this orbit a gift of a bed, if it were indeed a royal bed, or might it have been made anew? Let's explore a bit further. Mrs. Williamson writes then about the Queen's gift. And what's striking about the Queen's gift is that it's in modern English. It's Queen apostrophe S. Although the will of Mosley seems to have gone, if we look at the disputation in 1613, we find language like Roland Mosley, his sole executor, not Roland Mosley's sole executor. So there's a bit of an alarm bell there. And Mrs. Williamson tells us about her sources. She says she's written nothing that's not been previously published, therefore it's all derivative work. And she gives the books that she took her derivation from, the histories of Didsbury and Birch Chapels, curiously referenced within inverted commas as if one book, but in fact they're 2 separate books published by the Cheetham Society in Manchester, and also the Mosley Family Memorials. This is the book that she refers to, and here is the transcript of the will of Nicholas Mosley, and you'll see in John Booker's transcript that she relies on, that she gives and bequeaths to my said wife in lieu of her chamber 2 of my best beds with the furniture accordingly, except the best tapestry covering and the best bedstock also accepted. What you'll notice is that the Queen's gift is nowhere to be seen in this secondary source, more directly related to the original will, and because Mrs. Williamson has inserted it in modern English. Not only that, the covering, the best tapestry covering, has been duplicated by Mrs. Williamson, but both the Queen's gift and the coverings have been accepted by what really are peer-reviewed sources that now account for the story of this royal bed. So we have the first mention of a carved oak bedstead in the other book she mentions, which is Family, Not Memorials, but Memoirs by Sir Oswald Mosley. And he describes how Elizabeth I gave his ancestor a handsomely carved oak bedstead together with some other articles of furniture for the new house which he had recently erected at Hough End. This is the book of family memoirs, and he explains to us, he's very pleased, because he says the compiler of these memoirs has been fortunate enough to obtain many pieces of the handsome oak furniture which once adorned it. This is 1840s. Can you think of who might be involved? And yes, we see at Rolleston work by George Shaw, the acknowledged forger, is at work. Now, I'm very grateful that this buffet, which is shown in 1892 in the hallway at Rolleston, with the Mosley device here of the hammer or pick, is in New Orleans. Extraordinary to have made it across the Atlantic. And so we have evidence that Shaw was there. And he is also making this outrageous piece, which purports to be an Elizabethan settle with legs that you'd never see from an Elizabethan workshop, but with typical Shaw motifs, with NM 1596, in fact, 4 years before he was knighted, and then with these serpents on the top. If you go to Shaw's house, you'll see precisely these serpents lurking on the stairs. They were a great favorite of his. The first visual identification for this bed in these published sources is with Sid James lying in it, on the basis that the Mosleys had a house about 2 miles from Pinewood Studios, and so this is the likely their house, the likely origin for this as a film prop. So here's Sid James in Carry On Dick. Now there is a quick way of being able to work this out, because you can freeze frame and look at the material character of these posts, and you've got 1, 2, 3.5 diapers in this post, and there indeed is 3.5 diapers against the 4 diapers of the Henry VII bed, so it's not the same one. Shaw's, however, do have 1, 2, 3.5 posts, and its further use in television context tells us where this comes from. It comes from the Townley family. Shaw made this bed for the Townleys, a Catholic family from Lancashire of long standing. So if there's a film to be made of this, I like to think it's something like this. Sid James's Carry On Faking's George Shaw. Be nice to see that one day. So there's no evidence the Mosley family ever encountered the Henry VII bed. It is a final triumph of Shaw's audacity. What was that Elizabethan bed then? It was some spurious story that he'd sewn. Maybe it resembled his own Elizabethan bed, which was partly original and partly concocted by himself. So if we're to publish only those descriptions, explanations, interpretations which we've tested and found to be justified, where would I go? What would I suggest? Well, starting with these primary models used by Shaw, all of them would purport to be early Henry VII period. If they're correct, and they should be tested completely, they have gone through archaeometric testing of dendrochronology, which has been in conflict. So, and that needs to be resolved. But if all this is of one early period, the model worth testing, in my view, is that the origins of a marriage bed of impeccable concept from the Painted Chamber in Westminster, with accompanying wainscoting for the wall, and possibly some context like that for the arms, possibly set within some sort of enclosure, or that may have had a second life as a screen, would have gone, I think, in 1495 to Lancashire as a group. That puts it therefore in the early reign of Henry VIII. There is no, as in Henry VII rather, there's no later Elizabethan work that emerged with this group. And there's a particular reason in that year, in that Henry VII faced a year of crisis. In London was at the point of being invaded by troops in that year, and Latham was the house from which Bosworth was won. He didn't need to go and stay there for long. This was material was probably assembled within the so-called Eagle Tower of Latham, as a preparation for a potential retreat in case he had to face a second battle in his life. Does that sound romantic? Well, it always comes down to the end, into the end with what else can it be? Clearly, Shaw was ignorant of it. If this turns out to be work by a superior Victorian mind than George Shaw, who must predate him and predate Pugin, then let's work out who that person must have been, because he would be an unparalleled genius and the entire course of the Gothic revival would need to be rewritten. Whatever the solution, please don't occupy the blue to purple end of the spectrum. Get to the green side, be receptive, and actually be engaged in the pursuit of evidence for what I think is has the potential to be an extraordinary national asset, which brings alive the material culture and history of the early Tudor period. Thank you so much. Am I over time? I think I am a little.
Oh, no, never mind. Thank you very much. That was a fascinating piece of detective work.
Thank you.
That you presented there. I'm sure there will be questions about it as well. I certainly have some. Yes, well, one question I had was simply of a material nature. Like the first set of panels you showed had this remarkably fresh-looking backs that looks like recent wood.
Yeah.
How does that work, basically?
Yeah, thank you. And before I start with the questions, I'd like to acknowledge Diane Walker, who's been a fantastic ally in researching and challenging me with ideas. So I'd like to thank Diane now. Yes, the back of those fresh-looking panels, those initial impressions can be really leading and tend to make you think that some things are newer than they are. If you look at for example, the choir stalls of Winchester Cathedral, this is not dark old oak of the type that we're used to, and the bed that's behind you now, Rembrandt, the great bed of Ware. It doesn't belong to that period from the Jacobean period onwards, when japanned work was all the rage, and so things were covered with a kind of a blackened surface to emulate Japanese work. Instead, wood can still appear quite light and quite fresh, but in this case, I think it's particularly light and the surface is clean because the back of the panels has been planed. And I've seen this before where panels have been sold as if they are revivalist panels, but in fact they've been salvaged and reused, and to be set within a new frame, sometimes they've been sanded or planed at the back just to reduce their depth to arrive at a regular size for the joiner. And I think that's what's happened in this case. Right.
And so basically, even with wood of that age, if you go even a little below the surface, it starts looking really fresh again.
It can do. It oxidizes rather differently, and you'll see the underside of those coats of arms on the Chetham's library piece of furniture, a very great depth of oxidization. You see it on this particular bed as well. So there's obviously a certain kind of atmospheric conditions that do affect the way that tannin in oak ages and the appearance over time. But you know, if furniture isn't disrupted, you may find incredibly fresh-looking work. You might find dampness. You might find worm attack, even in the same piece. It just depends whether woodworm finds your furniture delicious or not, and sometimes which part of the log it's cut from, whether the heartwood or the sapwood, all of that bearing.
Now, I may have misunderstood, but those particular panels, did you also say that at some point they were covered in a layer of plaster work?
That's right. They were covered in a gesso, which is a plaster powder mixed with glue, and you find those typically Elizabethan, Jacobean, that sort of period. So that may well be when Anne of Cleves' house, and we now know that she spent quite a bit of time at Hever Castle. But I suspect that it was at Bletchingley in Surrey where she had a significant house. And I think that given that her steward was Thomas Cowarden, master of revels and tents at one point, but his own tomb is rather similar in concept. I suspect that the workshop was based in Bletchingley, that it comes from.
Right.
That there's maybe then Suffolk House, the attribution of the Museum of London piece. It was brought into central London as a smart, redundant interior. Of course, she died without issue in 1557. So it was a customary thing to assert your own identity in a house. And so they become covered with a stone-like effect for their next life.
Okay, and certainly one other unrelated question that I also had, because you mentioned in passing these burn marks, and I found that really interesting. And you said they were apotropaic. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, archaeologists don't like you to say witch marks, but they do like apotropaic. So this is a customary discovery in timber-framed houses is to see these tear-shaped burns, and they're very gouged. gouged. The thought is that they belong to two different processes. One is the moment of manufacture in a carpenter's yard or joiner's yard. You will have burning applied to timber, where you have a taper held against it for what, 30 seconds or a minute or something. Oak is quite hard to burn fresh. But what that does is apparently appeases some kind of fire sprite, you know, the devil that's blamed on house fires and setting fire to towns and the rest of it. And so you give something before you put it in place. You can say it's already been burnt. And psychologically, I find that fascinating. But there's another potential use in that sometimes you see this on items of furniture, as well as exposed timbers on interiors, and you find very deep gouges where people seem to have repeated the process of burning and gouging out. And that may be related to the medieval Candlemas celebrations in January, where you would carry a lit taper back from a church, and then you create a burn mark and then gouge it out. Archaeologists are still in discussion about this, but it's clearly part of a habit, a tradition, which I think the earliest we've seen is the 13th century, but it goes up to the 17th, but you don't really see it much after that. And certainly on no shore pieces. He was not interested in Candlemas or fire sprites.
His historical research was not that detailed, clearly.
It wasn't. In fact, I mean, Shaw is fascinating for having a workshop run by his extended family, who made very precise copies of the details of the historical pieces I've shown. But his ignorance was legion. He wrote articles flattering his friend Dearden in the Archaeological Journal, and antiquaries absolutely lampooned him for his ridiculous claims about buildings and places. So he was really no scholar, but he was a showman, and he was certainly a salesman.
Yeah, so all these things that he made, they were actually sold as authentic pieces.
They were all sold as authentic. He wove stories like, oh, I found this sideboard of your ancestors on the Lancashire-Yorkshire border somewhere. I can't tell you where it was because the vendors don't want me to let it out, but I can let you have it. And he would have done his research. He knew that the Duke of Northumberland was recasting Warkworth Castle, for example, and he needed it to be furnished, you know, in a convincing way. And so the Duke of Northumberland said, he seems to have an inexhaustible supply of genuine antiquities, and sent an agent to his house who actually concluded that Shaw did knock these things up and just put a black layer on them to make them look old. But still, the Duke of Northumberland thought, well, they look well enough. And so he eventually settled the bill.
Fantastic.
It's amazing that George Shaw wasn't arrested for it, but he did in the end become a GP or JP, a Justice of the Peace. And so I think, you know, once you become a lawyer, people tend to leave you alone.
That's the best way of protecting yourself, I guess.
Yeah, he had some heavy furniture to barricade himself in with as well.
Yes. Are there other questions from the audience?
4 chats there, Rembrandt.
Sorry?
We've got 4 chats going on there. Yeah.
Yes, there are more comments than I can read them out, but there are more comments than questions. Charlotte, thanks. Says very interesting talk. Thanks. Very clever in identifying the difference of age in the grammar use in the description of the Queen's bed.
Yeah.
And also interesting to see the repeated crescent markings on the wood, which you refer to as carpenter's marks. I would have assumed that they would have been bigger than that.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? Just enough for them to take a tally, those little C-shaped crescents on the two adjacent parts of a joint. Yeah, I think I made an error in one of the things I said. I think I described Mosley as the mayor of Manchester. He was the Lord Mayor of London and then he was knighted in 1600, but he took over the manor of Manchester. So just a slight variance. It's nothing material, as they say.
Right. And then also somebody comments that George Shaw sounded like the infamous textile collector Francis Bock, who cut up rare items to sell bits to various museums.
I must find out more about Francis Bock.
Yeah, that sounds intriguing in its own right, doesn't it?
I think maybe Carry On Snipping is the one after the film about Shaw. Carry On.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I mainly know these people who the forgers of Renaissance paintings who were active in 19th century Florence. And
yes,
clearly welcome grand tourists, which
yeah, and of course the consequence of that, the purchase of these items from these spurious characters in places like Florence has filled museums with relics that even today places like the Louvre are putting new techniques to some of their star exhibits and discovering that what they've presented as the acme of French medieval furniture has actually been something put together. And it's things like X-ray that show the modern nails, between the joints that were supposed to be hidden. So we're in an age now where we can put a lot of scientific analysis to these things. The problem with these various items has been that one early dendrochronology attempt claimed that the timber was felled sometime after 1756, which didn't make sense at all in terms of a cultural object. If there was a Georgian person who could have conceived it, I'd love to know who that is in the age of Robert Adam. And so we had it blind tested by another dendrochronologist who came up with an entirely different finding, that this was typical of European oak, because there was a pattern of disturbance every 4 years by what's called the cockchafer beetle, which defoliates trees and therefore stymies the growth in a regular way. It appears every 4 years. And so, we have these archaeometric techniques that are based on statistics. And if you're outside the scientific circle, all you can do is demonstrate that two results are not repeating. Any good science should, of course, be able to replicate its results. But to show them in confusion is really frustrating, because what's certain is that the wainscot posts are of the same timber as the bed.
Right.
So they come from one common source. And it's very tightly grown Baltic oak, which is in fact typical of the sort of material that was imported in the late Middle Ages. But because of this sequence, this disturbance, there seems to be some kind of statistical confusion. And only in the last 6 or 7 years has this aberration been identified. So, it's one of those things which is very frustrating, because as a non-scientist, if you raise objection, then you always have you would say that.
Yes.
So you have to allow the practitioners to work this out amongst themselves, but you can imagine there's something of a reluctance to admit that one of them must be wrong, but no one's going to say it. So I do, however, place enormous reliance on Helen Hughes finding medieval paint. I mean, you can hardly dispute that.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, some scientific evidence, like the X-rays that you mentioned just now, that it's clearly how do you say, self-evident, basically.
Yeah, it's empirical evidence. You can see it's there. It's not
Yeah,
just
exactly.
statistical reading. But I'm very grateful to that vet, because I said, I've got a post, an oak post. Can I put it in your X-ray machine? And she said, I'll do it for a cake. So I took a sponge cake in, and I thought, gosh, if I had asked that for a dog, it would be a cheap way to keep a pet. But she said, what shall I call it? And I said, well, just put Henry in as a name. So Henry went in the machine, and I was delighted to see those nails and pins. But it is the kind of technique that, if museums had access to that, it's a really wonderful way to see into the makings of a piece of furniture. It's great.
Yes. So you mean to say this is not something that is genuinely or generally accessible to furniture historians?
I have seen it done. I've seen it done by the Louvre, but what techniques do museums have at their disposal? I think there's a general nervousness about new discoveries, because dendrochronology involves at least shaving down the surface of enough rings that you can read it, which in many pieces of furniture you can't do. Or we've actually commissioned the DNA of timber, which confirmed that this was the Baltic oak and not the post 1756 oak, which had to be based in America to be correct. So this has been subject to an unusually broad array of tests. But museums don't do DNA on the species of the timber in their furniture, don't do things like carbon-14 because it's too recent, so they don't expect a reasonable a result within reasonable parameters. So there's a lot of connoisseurship, a lot of scholarship, but it would be, in the next 10, 20 years or so, I'm sure there will be techniques of dating which become much more applicable with smaller samples, which can be tested against things of known dates, and hopefully we'll be able to learn much more. And I'm sure much hair will turn grey in the process of discovering the true age of things.
I've got another question in the chat from Nick Wright, who says, very interesting talk, Jonathan. Thank you. Why do you think the bed hasn't been acquired by a national museum or a major collection?
Very good question. It's been on display at Auckland Castle and at the V&A and at Hever Castle as well for people to examine. I just think, having shown that spectrum of general nervousness, what is the point? Or where is the point where there is a consensus where people say, okay, this is evidence enough for this to be taken seriously? What is it? I think it's a residual nervousness, frankly. And I think that's partly reasonable, because on the face of it, it seems a ludicrous claim. But I would simply say that if the major institutions were interested in pursuing the evidence of these objects and considering what else they might be, they've got to be important on some level. So I don't know is the full answer. Maybe it's the first dendrochronology result claiming American white oak after 1756. Any confusion in that kind of data tends to make people extra nervous. There was a case for the Wolsey angels, the bronze angels, which belonged to Cardinal Wolsey's tomb. They were subject early on to a thermoluminescence test, which is a recording of the radioactive decay after metal is superheated. So you would tend to be able to read back to a point of its when it was in the foundry. And one of the Wolsey angels was thermoluminescence tested to 19th century. But then it was clearly demonstrated to have existed behind that. And so that technique was sort of forgotten about, So there are these hurdles, and they're reasonable because no one wants to commit and seem to be an idiot for having made a mistake. What I would really appreciate, Nick, is the interest of curators in saying, well, in what way can we confirm or deny what you're saying? And I think that kind of engagement, that collaborative a sort of respect, I guess, for scholarly pursuit on these things is embraced, because I think we've all got a lot to learn from this material.
I mean, it connects to another question I had, in the sense that the sort of the testing and the equipment for testing that museums may have specific that would be suitable also for pieces of furniture. Would you say that there is sort of less investment when it comes to furniture, historical furniture, than say painting?
Well, I don't know. I just think the museum world operates like the economy does. It's largely on emotion, and
Right, yeah.
and this kind of you tend to make your mind up quite early, and then it's quite difficult to shift. But Karl Popper wrote in the 1950s about the basis of science, is that successful science is not just something which is clearly replicable within its own discipline, but it should be considered within the body of evidence of many different approaches. And then we should find out where the common results are and where the outliers are, and work out, what the difference is and how to explain it. So we've got, for example, Helen's identification of typical medieval paint materials, methods, and application. We've got the DNA. We've got some very good dendrochronology to show the relationship between these pieces, and the two different results need to be reconciled. That's all. But that's a process that's, I think, yet fully to happen. But it requires a great deal of open-mindedness on the parts of practitioners, and the willingness to say, why is this? Where can this data be reconciled? And I don't know what the mechanism for that is, except for simply presenting it. Now, I didn't represent those results this evening, largely because there isn't time in 45 minutes. I thought the best thing to do is obviously show the materiality of them, what you can investigate empirically. But so no, I think that's the process to go through. But I think it's fascinating what we learn from looking at things in different ways. I mean, it really is. A program like Fake or Fortune with Philip Mole, there's lots of science used there, and it's always thrilling. And this should be a spectator sport, I think. Bring it out, yeah, bring it out, bring those results out.
As I said, you really made it into a detective story that was fascinating to follow.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I don't see any raised hands. Louisa, you have anything to ask? Okay, well, in that case, nothing remains than to thank you again for a really wonderful talk and insight into your work, and insight also into sort of the survival of pieces of Tudor furniture in different ways.
Well, once again, I appreciate the invitation, and thanks everybody for joining, and I hope to see you again.